Welcome to Charts This Week. My name's David Linton. I run Updater, and this week's edition for Monday, the 26th of October, comes to you from London. And we start, as always, by looking at crude. Crude prices falling back below the lows. Quite interesting here. Not the low that we saw back at the end of August, but we have this pattern where we have just started to wander below this. So it does look like this low is going to come under pressure with this low here below $48 at the moment on Brent, and the 45 level does now look like it will come under pressure. Correlation with the dollar is positive at the moment, which is unusual. Normally it's you would see it negative. We did see a strong dollar last week, which we'll talk about, so that does imply that we will see commodities coming off on the back of a stronger dollar as well. We've always look at this chart, the cloud chart. On the daily, we have been below. Interesting how we found resistance right on the cloud just in this sort of October high that we saw a couple of weeks ago. So the cloud has provided quite strong resistance. So we remain bearish while we're below the cloud. And of course, we continuously talk about the seasonality, and the seasonality for crude at this time of year is generally very bad. So against that backdrop, it would be hard to see crude rising and making new highs. If we look at the 60-minute chart, here we see really quite over the last week, really just quite a sustained downtrend below the cloud. So that is consistent with what we would expect. Shift T gives you the trends and targets on your updater system. Downside to 45.50 at the moment. That's 5% downside. So looking like we will see further falls this week. And then last of all, we take a look at the WTI price. Much the same picture here, of course. Shift T, and we do have many more downside targets here. 5% downside, 42.15, 42.20, that's what we'd call a cluster. Both those targets activated. So a good $2.50 downside from here, 5%. So we expect crude to come under pressure this week. And if we look at the spread's just opening out a little bit, $3.30 at the moment. So products just diverging a little bit there. That's quite interesting. If we take a look at US NatGas, this has been a really big mover in the week. Bearish on the long term below the weekly, bearish and below the daily here. The seasonality for NatGas is not great, and then look at how we just fell out of bed here. And this is the risk when you're below the clouds, both on the weekly and the daily. Then you should expect moves to the downside. And of course, once we'd fallen below on the 60-minute chart, that really is confirming bearish, medium term, long term, and short term. So now to the 20. NatGas really hitting seasonal lows again, and 214 is the downside target. That was given back at 245, so you can't ignore these targets when you see them. If you're trading NatGas, and a lot of our clients are using Updater on Henry Hub, Shift T on the 1 minute data, this is where you will see the picture emerging. So a little bit of an upside target, not yet activated, but this downside target at 218 hanging over us currently. So watch that 1 minute chart through the week, and of course our morning calls. So quite interesting there. If we look at European energy markets, MBP making fresh lows this morning, 39.05. Remember, these are the OTC. This is the front month contract on MBP. Real-time consolidated broker prices from the brokers on the Updater energy feed, all running on your Trayport screen. Remember, Updater does run on multiple sources, so you can run on your Trayport, you can run on your Reuters, so Thomson Reuters icon feeding in. That means that you can mix and match the data, so your OTC data might be coming from Trayport and your exchange data or other pricing from Thomson Reuters. And here we see how we really are pressuring this low that we saw back in January. So pretty bearish there on the daily chart. On the 60-minute chart, this is quite useful, but below the cloud we've really been bearish most of the time, puts us in a bearish frame of mind. Shift T will give you the trends and targets. No real clear downside targets here at the moment, so we need to probably go to the 1 minute chart to see where the shorter term targets are. Shift T and we've got a target of 38.40 in play at the moment, and that's again on your real-time OTC consolidated broker data, either off Trayport or Updata. If we look at TTF, not quite as bearish, not hitting fresh lows this morning, but not bullish either. I mean, still below the cloud. Shift T will give us some targets here. We do have clearer downside targets here, 17.15, 17.13. That's what we call a cluster, and there's even one to 16.95. So 17 is looking like a quite likely level for TTF front month. German power, we really were hitting fresh lows last week, just coming off the bottom a little bit at the end of the week, but this is not by any stretch a bullish chart. So really quite interesting there. And if we look back on the history, great thing about Updata, of course, is these long price histories, which really gives you quite a bit to look at here. If we look at the history, we really are just hitting multi-year lows here. If we look at German power, just coming through on the chart here, but below on the cloud still. Shift T will give you the trends and targets. Downside targets to 28.15, 28.35, 28.40. So we are seeing German power making fresh lows. If we look at coal, we see here coal prices again touching new lows. Correlation with Brent coming off a little bit, and we see here on the 60-minute chart again touching fresh lows below the cloud here, puts us in a bearish frame of mind. Shift T 46.05, 46.80. These are the targets that are in train at the moment. So another down week for coal looking likely. Emissions, here we see the weekly chart, bullish on the weekly, bullish on the daily, and bullish on the 60-minute. So we are seeing here on emissions one of the few charts in energy that is looking bullish. If you're trading emissions, this is on the ICE contract. Shift T, here are your trends and targets. 871 is the target that's in train at the moment. It's great, the 1-minute charts for trading emissions using the point and figure. If we take a look at Forex, quite a big week in Forex. Here is the dollar index chart. We see here how we've gone into this ascending symmetrical triangle pattern. We have broken up to the upside, and that's what we kind of expected. 98 is the key level here. We're at 96.90 at the moment, so we've still got another 1% to run to get through that previous high that we saw back in August, June, July, August. But what's interesting here, this is the weekly chart, remember it's long term. This break now out of this triangle pattern, especially if we can get above 98, means another run to the upside. So dollar looking strong dollar is really what we expect to see. And we saw the euro fall quite heavily on announcements in the eurozone last week. Really the interesting thing is we're back below the cloud, not quite yet on the lagging line, but all we have to do is hold these levels and we will wander through and be bearish again. We have had moments where we've just been below the cloud imminently, but here we've got a lot of space below the cloud. So all we have to do is stay below the 112.60 level, and we are in a bearish territory. So that will be interesting to watch play out in the coming weeks. Of course, this 108 level taken out would be bearish, and then we look back to the 105 level. So euro is looking now pretty bearish against the dollar. And if we look at the 60-minute chart, we actually gave the signal way back at the middle of the month. So these falls, this is what happens when you're below the cloud. Get used to expecting moves to the downside. Shift T, and we don't have any real clear trends and targets here. We could go to a smaller chart, and we do see here that if we make new lows, we've got another down to 107.50. So we need to make new lows to activate that target. If we look at sterling, sterling against the dollar, bearish, and it has been bearish and now for a couple of months as we've wandered below the cloud. So that's interesting. Note that it's often interesting to look at the price action here. There's a high and a low, then a lower high, lower low, lower high, lower low, lower high. It looks like we're heading back to make a new lower low. So below the cloud, of course, we should expect moves to the downside. Strong dollar, weak sterling in comparison. Shift T, gives you the trends and targets here. We did have this 160 target, which was looking a little bit encouraging, but that is starting to look like it will not play out in the short term with downside pressure here. So, and 147.80 hanging over us on the price. Here we look at the Euro Sterling chart, and 72 at the moment. So we're starting to nudge new lows here. Shift T 69.70. If we look back in July, we were at this sort of 69 level. Looks like we're going back to test that July low. So Euro the weaker currency, Sterling in the middle, dollar the strongest. If we look at equity markets, a really strong showing on Friday. In fact, last week was quite a strong week overall. We see here on the weekly chart, this is the long-term chart, the lagging line bouncing off the cloud. Really great signal this. Just confirming that the trend is in train still. The long-term trend is in train. Price back above the cloud. The lagging line still got a little bit more work to do. Maybe that will happen this week. But again, all we have to do is just wander sideways and we're back in bullish territory here. And the 60-minute cloud we're above here as well. The 1% target, the downside target wasn't activated, and here we see upside 6.5%, and we do have other upside targets, 13% and 23% on the S&P. So still a lot of upside to play for here. And the short-term target, we're seeing upside target of 4.75%. If we look at the NASDAQ, of course, the NASDAQ was where we saw a lot of strength at the end of last week. Really big move on the week, really big gap, breakaway gap here, where we move to on the daily chart, back above the cloud on the daily and above on the weekly. Didn't even get close to testing the cloud on the lagging line here, so showing real strength on the NASDAQ. 7% upside on the 1% or 13% here, 24% and another 7%, so a lot of upside in these markets. The 1% chart, the 60-minute chart, slightly exhausting itself, with not much more to play for here. So a move and another move up might give us another target there, but you can't say that this is not a bullish-looking market now. So looking like we will make new highs quite soon. A strong quarter to be expected. If we look at FTSE, FTSE wasn't quite as strongly performing last week as the US market. We see here on the weekly we just had a small move and we're below the cloud on the weekly, so that's heavily laden with oil and mining stocks is really what's pushed FTSE below here. We are seeing a recovery here on the price, much this on the daily, and the 60-minute we're above. The 1% chart is bearish as well, like the weekly chart, but we haven't activated this downside target. And more interestingly, this 0.5% chart has changed trend, new upside target, 15% on the FTSE. So looks like again FTSE will have a good run up to the year end, which we normally expect to see once we get through the October jitters. We normally expect to see markets start to run. So looking pretty good. If we take a look at the DAX. DAX, much the same picture, bullish on the weekly, not quite yet through on the daily, and bullish on the 60-minute chart. Lots of support here on the 1% chart, so the DAX looking pretty strong. Not quite above on the 0.5% chart, so that is one slight difference, but the market is looking good in the longer term. If we look at Asia, firstly we take a look at the Nikkei, new upside target here of 14%. Found support here on the 1% chart. Bullish, not quite bullish yet on the daily, bullish on the 60-minute chart, and a 3 or 4% upside target to play for on the 60-minute chart. So in the short term, that's looking pretty good. If we take a look at China, here we see on the Shanghai index how we're recovering on the price on the cloud. Not quite through yet on the daily. 60-minute chart is bullish, and we do start to see these upside targets, 12% here, 25% just activated this morning on this 0.5% chart, and 4.5% upside. So the Chinese market's starting to look pretty good for recovery as well. And last of all, we take a look at the Indian stock market, one of my favorite emerging markets, just to keep an eye on what's happening in emerging markets. Bullish on the weekly, through on the price on the daily, but not quite on the lagging line. Bullish on the 60-minute chart, 56% upside on the 1% chart. So long term, the Indian market looks really good, and then 5% upside on the short-term chart. So quite interesting, the Indian stock market looking good there, so emerging markets. But of course, the strong dollar is going to have a bit of an impact for some of these markets. That's it until next week. Happy charting. See you then.